Chapter 2. The Antechamber of Monsieur de Treville. Monsieur de Treville, as his family was yet called in Gascony, or Monsieur de Treville, as he called himself in Paris, had actually begun life like D'Artagnan, that is to say, without being worth a sou, but with that fund of audacity, esprit, and resolution which makes the poorest Gascon gentleman often inherit more in imagination than the richest nobleman of Perigord or Berry receives in reality. His daring and haughty courage, still more haughty in success, at the time when blows fell thick as hail, had raised him to the top of that difficult ladder which is called court favor, and which he had climbed 4 rungs at a time. He was the confidential friend of the king, who, as everyone knows, greatly honored the memory of his father, Henry IV. The father of Monsieur de Treville had served the latter so faithfully in his wars against the League that, for want of ready money, a commodity which during his life was very scarce in the Béarnese, who constantly paid his debts with what he never had occasion to borrow, that is to say, with his genius. For want of ready money, as we have said, he had authorized him, after the reduction of Paris, to take for his arms un lion d'or passant sur guerelles, with the motto Fidelis et Fortis. It was a great deal of honor, but not much profit. Therefore, when the illustrious companion of Henry the Great died, the sole inheritance he left his son was his sword, with the arms and motto. Thanks, however, to this double legacy, and to the name without tarnish which accompanied it, Monsieur de Treville was admitted into the household of the young prince, where he made such good use of his sword, and was so true to his motto, that Louis XIII, one of the best hands with the rapier in his own kingdom, used to say that if he had a friend who was going to fight, he would advise him to take for a second, first himself and then Treville, or perhaps even Treville before himself. On this account, Louis had a real affection for Treville, a royal affection, an egotistical affection, it must be allowed, but an affection nevertheless. In those unhappy days, it was an important consideration to surround oneself with men of Treville's stamp. Many could take for their device the epithet of Fortis, which formed the second part of the motto, but very few men could claim the epithet Fidelis, which formed the first part of it. Treville was one of the few. He was one of those rare organizations with the intelligence and obedience of the mastiff, and a blind courage and a ready hand, one to whom the eye had been given only to see whether the king was dissatisfied with any one, and the hand only to strike the offending person. A Besme, a Maravers, a Poltrot de Mer, a Vitry, in short, Treville only wanted an opportunity, but he watched for it and was resolved to seize it by its 3 hairs if ever it came within reach of his grasp. Louis XIII therefore appointed Treville captain of the Musketeers, who, by their devotion, or rather fanaticism, became what his ordinary troops were to Henry III, and his Scottish Guard to Louis XI. In this respect, the cardinal was not behind the king, for when he saw the formidable picked guard with which Louis surrounded himself, this second, or rather this first, king of France, wished also to have his own guard. He therefore, as well as the king, had his musketeers, and these 2 potent rivals were seen selecting for their service from all the provinces of France, and even from all foreign countries, men famous for their skill as swordsmen. It was not rare for Richelieu and the king, over their game of chess in the evening, to dispute concerning the merits of their respective followers. Each boasted of the deportment and the courage of his own, and whilst openly inveighing against duels and imbroglios, they secretly excited their respected partisans to fight, and experienced immoderate delight or intense chagrin at their respective victories or defeats. This, at least, says the memoir of one who was concerned in some of these defeats and many of these victories. Treville had seized on the weak point in his master's character, and to this knowledge he owed the long and constant favor of a king who has not left behind him the reputation of having been constant in his friendships. He paraded his musketeers before the Cardinal Armand Duplessis with an air of insolence which made the grey mustache of his eminence curl with anger. Treville had also thoroughly understood the war of that period, when, if you lived not at the expense of the enemy, you lived as that of your countrymen. His soldiers formed a legion of very devils under no discipline but his own. Swaggering bullies, given to wine, the king's musketeers, or rather Monsieur de Treville's, spread themselves through the taverns, the public walks, and the theatres, talking loud, curling their mustaches, jingling their swords, hustling the guards of the cardinal when they met them, indulging in the open street in 1,000 jokes, sometimes killed, but then certain of being lamented and avenged, sometimes killing, but then quite certain not to languish in prison, since Monsieur de Treville was always at hand to procure their pardon and release. Therefore, Monsieur de Treville was lauded in every tone, sung of in every key by these men who adored him, yet, hangdogs as they were, they trembled before him as scholars before their master, obedient to a word and ready to meet death to wipe away any reproach. Monsieur de Treville had used this powerful lever first for the king and his friends, and next for himself and his own friends. The captain of the musketeers was therefore admired, feared, and loved, which state constitutes the apogee of human affairs. Louis XIV absorbed all the lesser stars of his court by his vast brilliancy, but his father, sol pluribus impar, imparted his personal splendor to many of his favorites, his individual valor to each of his courtiers. Besides the king's levy and those of the cardinal, there were then at Paris at least 200 smaller ones, fairly exclusive, and amongst these 200 smaller levies, that of Monsieur de Treville was one of the most frequented. From 6 o'clock in the morning during summer and 8 in the winter, the courtyard of his hotel in the Rue du Vieux Colombier resembled a camp. From 50 to 60 musketeers who appeared to relieve each other, and to present a number always imposing, were stalking about incessantly, armed to the teeth, and ready for anything. From one end to the other of those long staircases on whose space our modern civilization would build an entire mansion, ascended and descended these petitioners who sought favors with provincial gentlemen, eager to be enrolled, and liveried lackeys of every color, in the act of delivering messages from their masters to Monsieur de Treville. In the antechamber, on long circular benches, reclined the elite, that is, such of them as had assembled. A continual buzzing prevailed from morning till night, whilst Monsieur de Treville, in his cabinet adjoining the antechamber, received visits, listened to complaints, gave his orders, and, like the king in his balcony at the Louvre, had only to place himself at his window to review his men and their arms. On this day when D'Artagnan presented himself, the assembly was very imposing, especially to provincial just arrived in Paris. It is true this provincial was a Gascon, and at this period more especially, D'Artagnan's countrymen had the reputation of not being easily intimidated. In fact, as soon as anyone had passed the threshold of the massive door, studded with long square nails, he found himself in the midst of a troop of swordsmen who were cruising about the court, talking, quarreling, and jesting with each other. To clear a path through these eddies, it was necessary to be an officer, a man of rank, or a pretty woman. It was, therefore, in the midst of this crowd and disorder that our youth, holding his long rapier against his slender legs and the rim of his beaver in his hand, advanced with palpitating heart, yet with that sort of half-smile of provincial embarrassment which wishes to create a good impression. When he had passed one group, he breathed more freely, but he perceived that they turned to look at him, and D'Artagnan, who to that day had invariably entertained a pretty good opinion of himself, for the first time in his life thought himself ridiculous. When he had reached the staircase, it was still worse. On the first step were 4 musketeers, who amused themselves in the following manner, whilst 10 or a dozen of their companions waited on the landing place till it was their turn to have a share in the game. One of them, on a higher step, with a naked sword in his hand, prevented, or endeavored to prevent, the other 3 from mounting the stairs, whilst these 3 skirmished with him very actively with their swords. D'Artagnan at first took these swords for foils, and thought they were buttoned, but he soon found by certain scratches that each weapon was as sharp as possible, and at each of these scratches not only the spectators but the actors themselves laughed most heartily. The one who held the higher step at the time kept his opponents at bay in a dexterous manner. A circle was formed round him on the condition of the game being that at every hit he who was struck should relinquish the pastime and surrender his turn of reception by Monsieur de Treville to the one who had touched him. In 5 minutes 3 were grazed, one on the hand, one on the chin, and another on the ear, by this defender of the staircase who was himself untouched, a proof of his skill which, according to the rules of the game, entitled him to 3 turns of favor. This sport surprised our young traveller, although he did not wish it to appear that he was astonished. He had seen his own province, that province where, moreover, the fiery passions are so promptly roused, a good many provocatives to duels, and yet the gasconade of these 4 players appeared much stronger than any he had ever heard of, even in Gascony. He fancied he was transported into that famous country of giants where Gulliver afterwards went, and was so much frightened. And yet he had not reached the end. The landing place and antechamber still remained. On the landing place they did not fight, but recounted histories of the fair sex, and in the antechamber tales of the court. On the landing place D'Artagnan blushed, in the antechamber he shuddered. But if his good manners were shocked on the landing place, his respect for the cardinal was scandalized in the antechamber. There, to his great astonishment, he heard the policy which made all Europe tremble, openly criticized, as well as the private life of the cardinal, which so many powerful men had been punished for attempting to scrutinize. That great man, whom D'Artagnan's father had so deeply reverenced, Monsieur de Treville and his men made their butt, deriding his bandy legs and crooked back. Some sang carols on Madame d'Aiguillon, his mistress, and Madame de Cobalat, his niece, while others planned adventures against the pages and guards of the Cardinal Duke himself. All these things appeared to D'Artagnan monstrous impossibilities. Nevertheless, when the name of the king accidentally slipped out in the midst of these jokes on the cardinal, a sort of momentary gag stopped all their jeering mouths, and they looked around with hesitation and seemed to doubt the discretion of the wall of Monsieur de Treville's cabinet. But some allusions soon brought back the conversation to his eminence. The wit was of the most brilliant kind, and none of his actions were uncommented upon. Verily, thought D'Artagnan with terror, these gentry will soon be put into the Bastille and hanged. Doubtless I shall accompany them for having heard all they have said. I shall without doubt be taken for accomplice. What would my father say, he who enjoined me so strongly to respect the cardinal, if he knew that I was in the company with such reprobates? Of course, while D'Artagnan dared not join in the conversation, he kept his eyes and ears wide open, and every sense on the alert that he might lose nothing, and in spite of the paternal advice, he found himself drawn by his tastes and instinct, rather to praise than blame the incredible things he heard around them. Nevertheless, as he was absolutely a stranger to the crowd of Monsieur de Treville's courtiers, and it was the first time he had been seen there, someone came to inquire what he wanted. At this question he humbly gave his name, relying on his being a countryman, and requested the servant to solicit a moment's audience of Monsieur de Treville, a request which the inquirer, in the tone of a protector, promised to make at the proper time. D'Artagnan, a little recovered from his first surprise, had now time to study the dresses and countenances of those around him. In the midst of the most animated group was a musketeer of great height, of a haughty countenance, and so fantastical a costume as to attract general attention. He did not wear his uniform tunic, which was not absolutely indispensable at that period of less liberty, yet greater independence, but a close coat of celestial blue, slightly faded and worn, and on this coat a magnificent border of gold embroidery, which glittered like scales upon a sunlit stream. A long mantle or cloak of crimson velvet hung gracefully from his shoulders, discovering the front alone of his splendid belt, from which depended his enormous rapier. The musketeer, who had just come from guard, complained of having caught cold, and coughed occasionally with great affectation. Therefore, as he averred, he had taken his cloak, and whilst he was talking loudly over the group and proudly curling his mustache, everyone much admired the embroidered belt and D'Artagnan more than anyone else. "What would you have?" said the Musketeer. "It is the fashion. I know very well that it is foolish, but it is the fashion. Besides, one must spend one's hereditary property on something or other." "Ah, Porthos," cried one of the bystanders, "do not try to make us believe that this lace comes from the paternal generosity. It was given you by the veiled lady with whom I met you the other Sunday, near the gate of Saint-Honore. No, upon my honor, and by the faith of a gentleman, I bought it with my own money," said he whom they called Porthos. "Yes, as I bought this new purse with what my mistress put in the old," cried another Musketeer. "But it is true," said Porthos, "and the proof is that I paid 12 pistols for it." The wonder and admiration were redoubled, though the doubt still existed. "Is it not so, Aramis?" inquired Porthos, turning to another Musketeer. The person thus appealed to formed a perfect contrast to the one who thus questioned him, and who designated by the name of Aramis. He was a young man, not more so than 22 or 23 years of age, with a soft and ingenuous countenance, a black and mild eye, and cheeks rosy and damask as an autumnal peach. His slender mustache marked a perfect straight line along his upper lip. His hands appeared to dread hanging down for fear of making their veins swell, and he was continually pinching the tips of his ears to make them preserve a delicate and transparent carnation hue. Habitually he talked little and slowly, often bowed, laughed quietly, merely showing his teeth, which were good, and of which, as the rest of his person, he appeared to take the greatest care. He replied to his friend's question by an affirmative inclination of the head, and this affirmation appeared to settle all doubt concerning the embroidery. They therefore continued to admire it, but said no more about it, and by a sudden change of thought, the conversation at once passed to another subject. "What do you think of this story of Chalais' squire?" inquired another Musketeer, not addressing anyone in particular, but the company in general. "And what does he say?" demanded Porthos in a conceited tone. "He says that he found Rochefort, the tool of the cardinal, at Brussels, disguised as a Capuchin friar, and this cursed Rochefort, thanks to his disguise, had deceived Monsieur de Lagnes, simpleton as he is." "He is a simpleton," said Porthos, "but is it a fact?" "I heard it from Aramis," answered the Musketeer. "Really?" "Ah, you know it well enough, Porthos," said Aramis. "I told it you myself yesterday evening. Do not let us talk any more about it." "Not talk any more about it? That's your view of the matter," said Porthos. "Not talk any more about it? Egad, you would make some short work of it. What, the cardinal sets a spy upon a gentleman, robs him of his correspondence through a traitor, a robber, a gallows bird, cuts Chalais' throat through this spy, and by means of this correspondence, under the flimsy pretext that he desired to kill the king, and marry Monsieur to the queen? No one knew one word of this enigma. You told us of it yesterday evening to the great astonishment of everyone, and whilst we are all still amazed at the news, you come today and say to us, 'Let us talk no more about it.'" "Well, then, since it better suits your humor, let us talk about it," calmly replied Aramis. "Were I poor Chalais' squire," said Porthos, "this Rochefort would pass a bad minute with me." "And the Red Duke would make but short work with you," replied Aramis. "Ah, the Red Duke! Bravo, bravo, the Red Duke!" exclaimed Porthos with an approving nod, and clapping his hands. "The Red Duke is charming. Rest assured, my dear fellow, that I will disseminate the title. What a genius he has, this Aramis! What a pity that you could not follow your vocation, my dear fellow! What an exquisite abbé you would have made!" "Oh, it is a mere transitory delay," replied Aramis. "One day or another I shall be one. For you well know, Porthos, that I continue to study theology with that intention." "He will actually do as he says," replied Porthos. "He will do it sooner or later." "Very soon," said Aramis. "He only waits for one thing to decide what he will do, "And to resume his cassock, which is hung up behind his uniform," replied another musketeer. "And what event does he wait for?" inquired another. "He waits till the Queen has given an heir to the crown of France." "Let us not jest on this subject, gentlemen," said Porthos. "Thank God the Queen is yet of an age to give it one." "It is said that the Duke of Buckingham is in France," observed Aramis with a mocking laugh, which gave to his remark, simple as it was in appearance, a meaning sufficiently scandalous. "Aramis, my friend, this time you are wrong," rejoined Porthos, "and your wit always leads you too far. It would be the worse for you if Monsieur de Treville heard you talking in this manner." "Do not lecture me, Porthos," said Aramis, in whose soft eye something like the lightning's flash now passed. "My dear fellow, be either musketeer or abbé, one or the other, but not one and the other," exclaimed Porthos. "You may remember that Athos told you the other day that you eat at every rack. But let us not dispute, I beseech you. It would be perfectly useless. You know what is settled between you and me and Athos. You go to Madame d'Aiguillon's and you pay her attentions. Then you repair to Madame de Bois Tracy, the cousin of Madame de Chevreuse, and a woman in whose graces you are thought to stand highly. Nay, my dear fellow, confess not your good fortune. No one demands your secret. Everyone knows your discretion. But since you possess this virtue yourself, surely you will not grudge some portion of it to the Queen. Let who will talk about the King and the Cardinal, but the Queen is sacred, and if you discuss her at all, let it be respectfully." "Porthos, you are as presumptuous as Narcissus," said Aramis. "You know that I detest moralizing, except from Athos. As to you, my dear fellow, you have rather too splendid a belt to be powerful on that subject. I will be an abbé if it suits me, and in the meantime I am a musketeer, in which character I say what I choose, and at this moment I choose to tell you that you irritate me. Aramis! Porthos! That will do, gentlemen, gentlemen," cried out all around them. "Monsieur de Treville awaits Monsieur d'Artagnan," interrupted the lackey, opening the door of the cabinet. At this declaration, during which the door remained open, everyone was silent, and in the midst of this general silence, the young Gascon, passing through part of the antechamber, entered the cabinet of the captain of the musketeers, felicitating himself with all his heart upon just escaping the conclusion of this singular quarrel.